What if the path to renewal inside the body does not always require absence, but sometimes presence? For years, we've been told that to awaken deep cellular repair, we must step away from food entirely, enduring long fasts as a kind of biological test of will. Yet the human body, especially after 60, often responds better not to deprivation, but to intelligent nourishment. Imagine a scenario where, instead of 3 days without eating, the body is gently guided for 36 hours with a single, humble food, rich in signals the body understands deeply. Sardines, small and unassuming, carry within them a biochemical language that speaks directly to autophagy, inflammation, and visceral fat in a way that long fasting sometimes struggles to achieve in later life. Autophagy is often described as cellular housekeeping, but that description barely captures its elegance. It is the body's way of recognizing what no longer serves it, breaking down damaged proteins, dysfunctional components, and metabolic debris, then recycling them into something useful. This process does not activate simply because food disappears. It activates when cells sense a shift in energy signaling, nutrient balance, and metabolic stress that is manageable rather than overwhelming. After 60, prolonged fasting can push the body into a stress response, elevating cortisol and encouraging visceral fat to cling tighter, not because the body is stubborn, but because it is protective. The body is older, wiser, and more cautious with its reserves. Sardines offer a different signal. They are dense in protein, rich in omega-3 fatty acids, and naturally low in carbohydrates, creating a metabolic environment where insulin remains low without the alarm of starvation. Protein provides amino acids that preserve muscle tissue, which is critical after 60, because muscle is not just for movement, it is a metabolic organ that guides fat usage. Omega-3 fats quietly reduce inflammation, improving insulin sensitivity and calming the inflammatory output of visceral fat. In this state, the body does not panic. Instead, it reallocates energy. Fat stores, especially those deep around the organs, begin to release fatty acids, not under threat, but under guidance. Autophagy responds to this calm metabolic shift. When insulin is low and nutrients are specific rather than abundant, cells begin selective cleanup. They do not shut down, they refine. Mitochondria become more efficient, damaged components are dismantled, and cellular signaling improves. The presence of nutrients from sardines supports this process by preventing muscle breakdown and excessive stress hormone release, both of which can blunt autophagy in older adults. Rather than forcing the body into survival mode, this approach invites it into restoration mode. Visceral fat, highly sensitive to inflammation and hormonal stress, responds quickly to this environment. As omega-3s lower inflammatory signaling and protein stabilizes blood sugar, visceral fat loses its defensive posture. Fatty acids are released steadily and used efficiently by muscles and the liver. The body senses safety, not scarcity, and this perception changes everything. Energy becomes more stable, mental clarity improves, and internal pressure eases in a way that extreme fasting rarely produces after 60. There is something quietly philosophical in this. Aging bodies often thrive not on extremes, but on precision. 36 hours of intentional nourishment can speak more clearly to the body than 3 days of silence. It reflects a deeper truth about human biology. Healing does not always come from doing less, but from doing what aligns more closely with the body's evolved intelligence. In this alignment, autophagy awakens, visceral fat loosens its grip, and the body remembers that repair and nourishment were never meant to be enemies, but partners in the long conversation of health and longevity. Autophagy is often portrayed as a simple switch that flips on only when food disappears completely, but the reality inside the human body is far more nuanced, especially after the age of 60. Autophagy responds to a pattern of metabolic signals rather than a single act of deprivation. Cells pay attention to insulin levels, nutrient availability, inflammatory cues, and energy demand, interpreting these signals together before deciding whether to initiate internal cleanup. When food is removed entirely for long periods, the body may initially increase autophagic activity, but in older adults, this state can quickly blend into a stress response where survival becomes the priority rather than repair. In that environment, cortisol rises, muscle tissue becomes vulnerable, and visceral fat tightens its grip as a protective reserve. The aging body is not less capable, it is more discerning. After decades of experience, it has learned to interpret prolonged scarcity as a potential threat rather than an opportunity. This does not mean autophagy becomes inaccessible, but that it requires a different invitation. Lowering insulin through carbohydrate restriction, stabilizing blood sugar, and reducing inflammatory signals can activate autophagic pathways without forcing the body into alarm. This is where the distinction between absence and precision becomes essential. Autophagy thrives when cells sense low insulin and controlled nutrient flow, not when they feel abandoned. Protein intake plays a surprisingly supportive role in this context. While excessive protein can suppress autophagy, moderate, well-timed protein helps preserve muscle and prevents the breakdown that often accompanies extended fasting in older adults. Muscle preservation is not cosmetic. Muscle tissue influences metabolic rate, insulin sensitivity, and fat utilization. When muscle is protected, the body feels less threatened, allowing autophagic processes to unfold selectively rather than defensively. This selective autophagy is more refined, targeting damaged cellular components without triggering widespread tissue breakdown. Fat quality matters deeply too. Omega-3 fatty acids reduce inflammatory signaling at the cellular level, calming the metabolic environment in which autophagy operates. Inflammation interferes with cellular repair by flooding the system with distress signals, making cleanup inefficient and incomplete. When inflammation is lowered, cells regain clarity, recognizing what needs to be recycled and what must be preserved. Autophagy becomes quieter, more efficient, and more sustainable. After 60, the goal shifts from maximizing stress to maximizing clarity. Autophagy does not need to be forced through extreme fasting. It needs to be invited through metabolic calm. Low insulin, stable energy, preserved muscle, and reduced inflammation create a state where cells willingly engage in repair. In this state, visceral fat becomes a usable energy source rather than a defended fortress, and cellular cleanup unfolds not as a crisis response, but as a natural rhythm of maintenance and renewal, aligned with the body's evolved intelligence. Prolonged fasting is often framed as a universal solution, a kind of metabolic reset that applies equally at any age. Yet the internal experience of a 3-day fast changes significantly as the body grows older. After 60, the body's primary objective shifts from rapid adaptation to long-term preservation. When food is absent for extended periods, the nervous system and endocrine system interpret this not simply as a cleansing opportunity, but as a potential threat to stability. Stress hormones such as cortisol rise in response, mobilizing energy quickly but at a cost. This hormonal surge is not a failure of will or discipline. It is an evolved protective response designed to safeguard vital organs and brain function when resources appear uncertain. Cortisol plays a central role in this process. In short bursts, it's useful, helping release energy and maintain blood sugar. Over multiple days of fasting, however, elevated cortisol can interfere with insulin sensitivity, increase inflammation, and signal the body to conserve fat, particularly visceral fat. Visceral fat is highly responsive to stress signals because it acts as an emergency energy reserve. When cortisol remains high, this deep fat becomes more defensive, less willing to release stored energy, and more likely to contribute to inflammatory signaling. What appears on the surface as metabolic discipline can quietly become a state of internal resistance. Muscle tissue also becomes vulnerable during prolonged fasting in later life.
As growth hormone and anabolic signals decline naturally with age, extended food absence increases the likelihood that the body will break down muscle to maintain essential functions. This muscle loss reduces metabolic demand, which paradoxically makes fat loss more difficult. When muscle mass declines, the body requires fewer calories, and visceral fat gains a stronger foothold. The fast may continue, but the metabolic engine slows, prioritizing survival over optimization. The brain, too, influences this response. Extended fasting activates ancient neural pathways associated with scarcity and threat. These pathways sharpen alertness, but also heighten stress perception. Sleep quality may decline, hunger signals become more erratic, and emotional resilience is tested. None of this is accidental. It is the body's attempt to keep itself safe. Yet in this state, autophagy and fat reduction no longer operate in their most efficient form.
Autophagy is often described as a switch that turns on only in the absence of food, but in reality, it is more like a dimmer, constantly adjusting to the signals the body receives. Protein intake, especially from nutrient-dense sources, does not shut this process down as aggressively as many believe. In older adults, the body responds more intelligently to quality signals than to extremes. When essential amino acids arrive alongside omega-3 fats and micronutrients, cells sense nourishment without excess. This balance allows autophagy to continue at a meaningful level while avoiding the stress response that prolonged deprivation can trigger. Sardines provide a unique biological message. They're small, low on the food chain, and rich in nutrients that human metabolism recognizes as supportive rather than threatening. The proteins they contain arrive in modest amounts, enough to preserve muscle tissue and maintain metabolic rate without flooding insulin pathways. This is crucial after 60, when muscle acts as a primary regulator of glucose and fat metabolism. Preserving muscle sends a signal of safety to the body, and safety is a condition under which cellular repair processes function more smoothly. Omega-3 fatty acids further refine this message. These fats integrate into cell membranes, improving their flexibility and communication. More flexible membranes allow better nutrient transport and waste removal, which indirectly supports autophagy by making cleanup more efficient. Omega-3s also reduce inflammatory signaling, lowering background stress in the body. When inflammation quiets, autophagy becomes more targeted and purposeful, focusing on damaged proteins and dysfunctional mitochondria rather than responding to emergency signals. Micronutrients play an equally quiet but essential role. Sardines provide selenium, iodine, vitamin D, and B vitamins, all of which participate in mitochondrial function and energy regulation. Mitochondria are central to autophagy because damaged mitochondria are one of the primary targets for cellular recycling. When these organelles are well supported nutritionally, the process of identifying and removing faulty components becomes more precise. Autophagy shifts from a blunt survival mechanism into a refined maintenance system. Another overlooked factor is hormonal stability. Eating sardines over a short window maintains steadier levels of insulin, leptin, and thyroid hormones compared to complete fasting. This hormonal steadiness reassures the brain that energy availability remains predictable. In response, cortisol remains lower, and the body does not cling to visceral fat as aggressively. Autophagy, under these calmer conditions, operates alongside fat metabolism rather than competing with it. The idea that nourishment and cellular cleansing must be opposites is a misunderstanding rooted in younger physiology. After 60, the body favors cooperation over confrontation. A nutrient-rich, restrained intake communicates trust, allowing autophagy to proceed without sacrificing muscle, metabolic rate, or emotional equilibrium. In this environment, cellular renewal becomes sustainable, visceral fat loosens its grip, and the body moves quietly toward balance rather than being forced into it through deprivation. Visceral fat is not just a storage problem, it is a survival response shaped by hormones, stress signals, and inflammation inside the body, and this is why it behaves differently from the fat you can pinch under your skin. When the body feels unsafe due to chronic stress, poor sleep, blood sugar spikes, or constant inflammation, it shifts into a protective mode, where visceral fat becomes an active organ producing stress hormones and inflammatory chemicals. In this state, the body is not interested in releasing stored energy, it is focused on guarding it. This is why aggressive dieting, extreme exercise, and constant calorie restriction often make visceral fat more stubborn instead of reducing it. The body interprets these actions as threats, tightening its grip on energy reserves rather than letting them go. Safety is the missing signal most people overlook. When the nervous system feels calm and supported, the hormonal environment begins to change in subtle but powerful ways. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, starts to normalize instead of staying chronically elevated. Lower cortisol reduces the constant message telling the body to store fat around vital organs. At the same time, insulin becomes more stable when blood sugar spikes are minimized. Stable insulin is crucial because high, frequent insulin levels signal the body to lock fat in place. When insulin remains balanced, fat cells receive permission to release stored energy instead of hoarding it. Inflammation plays a central role in this process. Visceral fat thrives in an inflammatory environment, feeding off processed foods, poor gut health, disrupted sleep, and unresolved stress. When inflammation is reduced through whole foods, gentle movement, proper hydration, and rest, the internal chemistry shifts. Fat cells become more responsive to hormonal cues, and the body begins to access stored energy more efficiently. This is why people often notice reductions in waist size when they improve sleep quality or reduce chronic stress, even without dramatic changes in calories. Hormonal balance also depends on rhythm. Eating at consistent times, allowing the body breaks between meals, and respecting natural circadian cycles all signal safety. When the body knows energy is coming regularly and reliably, it no longer needs to store excess reserves around the organs. Gentle activities like walking, stretching, and breathing exercises further reinforce this message. These movements lower inflammation and improve insulin sensitivity without triggering a stress response, making them far more effective for visceral fat reduction than punishing workouts. Visceral fat responds best to cooperation, not force. When you lower inflammation, stabilize insulin, and create a sense of internal safety, the body naturally begins to release what it no longer needs. This process is slower than crash dieting, but it is sustainable and protective. Instead of fighting your biology, you work with it, allowing energy to flow out as the body regains trust in its environment and its signals, leading to lasting changes in health, metabolism, and waistline without triggering the defensive mechanisms that keep visceral fat locked in place. After 60, the body no longer responds well to extremes, especially when it comes to food restriction. Long fasts and aggressive calorie cutting may promise quick results, but they often create more harm than healing in an aging system. Precision nourishment works differently because it respects how the body changes with age, focusing on what to include rather than what to remove. When the body receives the right nutrients at the right times, it shifts out of survival mode and into repair mode, allowing fat reduction and cellular renewal to happen together rather than in conflict. As we age, cellular communication becomes less efficient and recovery slows down. Muscles, bones, and organs require steady signals of nourishment to maintain strength and function. Extreme deprivation sends the opposite message, telling the body that resources are scarce. In response, metabolism slows, stress hormones rise, and fat loss becomes harder instead of easier. Precision nourishment avoids this trap by delivering protein, minerals, healthy fats, and micronutrients in balanced amounts that support muscle preservation, hormone stability, and mitochondrial function. When cells are well fed, they become more efficient at burning energy instead of storing it. Targeted nutrition also supports insulin sensitivity, which is critical after 60. Instead of long fasts that can destabilize blood sugar and increase cortisol, intelligent feeding keeps glucose levels steady throughout the day. Stable blood sugar reduces inflammation and prevents the hormonal spikes that encourage fat storage, especially around the abdomen.
When insulin remains balanced, fat cells receive clear signals to release stored energy, while muscles and organs receive the fuel they need to stay active and resilient. Cellular repair depends heavily on amino acids, antioxidants, and essential fats. Precision nourishment ensures these building blocks are available for processes like tissue repair, immune function, and detoxification. Without them, the body prioritizes survival over renewal, slowing fat loss and accelerating aging. Proper nourishment activates pathways involved in autophagy and mitochondrial renewal in a gentler and more sustainable way than prolonged fasting, allowing the body to repair itself without triggering stress responses. Another overlooked benefit of precision nourishment is its impact on consistency. Extreme deprivation is difficult to maintain and often leads to cycles of restriction and overeating, which further disrupt metabolism. Targeted feeding creates a sense of safety and satisfaction, reducing cravings and emotional stress around food. When eating becomes supportive rather than punitive, adherence improves naturally, and long-term fat reduction becomes more achievable. After 60, the goal is not to push the body harder, but to support it smarter. Precision nourishment aligns with the body's need for stability, repair, and efficiency, proving that intelligent feeding can outperform extreme deprivation. By nourishing cells instead of starving them, the body regains the ability to heal, release excess fat, and maintain strength, creating lasting metabolic health without the risks that come from long fasts and aggressive restriction.